A cold-hearted billionaire offers a desperate homeless violinist an impossible deal. "I'll pay you $10,000 a week to make my dying father feel something before he dies." For Chloe, facing eviction, the money is survival. For Damien, a man who sees the world as data, it's a simple transaction. He believes he can buy her music, her pain, and even a miracle. But he is about to learn that true emotion cannot be bought. The girl he hired isn't just playing music. She holds the key to a lifetime of regret. This is a story of how one simple, heartbreaking melody shattered a billionaire's cold defenses and exposed the one thing his money could never, ever fix. In the final moments, before it was too late. The screech of the Richmond Daly City BART train was a jarring scratch across glass, cutting the air. At Powell Street Station, 6 p.m., the air was a mixture of human breath, the faint stench of old urine wafting from a hidden corner, and the metallic tang of ozone from the third rail. Chloe stood leaning against a grime-caked, tiled pillar. Her thin wool coat no match for the damp, characteristic San Francisco chill seeping up from the subway concrete. She was playing. Not some easy pop tune to earn a few spare coins. She was playing Bach's Sarabande. The index and middle fingers of her left hand were calloused, but the tip of her pinky was raw, almost numb. Every time she pressed a string, a sharp pain shot up her arm. The violin she played, a cheap Chinese-made replacement, produced a thin, weak sound. It was like a whisper in a hurricane of rushing footsteps, static-laced PA announcements, and the loud laughter of teenagers walking past. The sarabande demanded a depth of resonance from the chest that this instrument could never deliver. It was like trying to tell a profound secret in a voice that was already broken. Her music was an act of defiance, a final cling to the person she used to be, a classical violinist who had once stood on the stage of Davies Symphony Hall, even if only with the youth orchestra. As she drew the bow, a sudden image surfaced, sharp and painful. 3 months ago, the one California bus labored up the steep hill of Pacific Heights. She got off in front of a white limestone mansion, one with a view overlooking the entire Golden Gate Bridge. A man in a thin silk suit, probably some tech art collector, answered the door. He was polite, almost kind. "It's magnificent," he said, his voice thick with admiration as he examined the Gagliano, her great-grandfather's heirloom. Its amber varnish seemed to glow under the halogen lights. Chloe said nothing. She just looked at the check. The number on it enough to pay for 2 weeks of experimental treatment and end-of-life care for her father. She placed the violin in his hands. The feeling as she left the empty case high, sickeningly light on her back, was like a betrayal. Like she had just sold a piece of her family's soul. The money was gone, vanished like morning fog. All that remained was the stack of medical bills piled on her kitchen table like paper tombstones. She finished the piece. The silence held for a second before the station's noise rushed in to fill it. A man in a business suit tossed a quarter into her open case. The clink of metal on the worn velvet lining sounded tiny. She wasn't playing for her father anymore. She was playing in spite of the fact that he was gone. She played because if she stopped the cold, and the reality of San Francisco would swallow her whole. The old phone in her coat pocket vibrated a weak buzz. She glanced at the cracked screen. A text from her landlord. a faceless property management company. Landlord. Rent is late this month. This is the final warning. Payment required in 48H or eviction proceedings will begin. Her hand trembled. She took a deep breath, the cold hitting her lungs. She closed her eyes, raised the violin, and began to play again from the top. But this time the sound that came out wasn't Bach. It was a silent scream. 40 miles south in a glass and steel office building on Sand Hill Road, the silence was of a completely different quality. It was absolute, sterile, temperature-controlled, and air-filtered. Damien Thorne stood before a glass wall looking out at the parched California hills, a patient desiccated yellow. His office was an exercise in minimalism, a carbon fiber desk, an Aeron chair, and 3 8K monitors displaying complex data streams. Damien was an oracle of Silicon Valley. He didn't predict the future. He read patterns. He could look at micro fluctuations in the stock market and see an industry's collapse. He could analyze social data trends and identify the next unicorn before the founders had even finished their business plan. He was examining a predictive model for the lithium-ion market. Beautiful, perfect, logical. But in his mind, there was a corrupted file, a stream of junk data he couldn't analyze or delete. His phone, a monolithic black ceramic device, vibrated softly on the desk. It was the private nurse. He took the call, activating the speakerphone. "Mr. Thorne?" The nurse's voice came even and professional. "Mr. Arthur is refusing to eat again, and he wasn't responding to verbal stimuli this morning." Damien frowned. He turned back toward the monitors. "What are his vitals?" "Stable, but he's losing weight. The feeding tube nutritional formula seems..." "Adjust the nutritional algorithm," Damien cut in, his eyes fixed on a chart. "Increase the protein ratio by 5% and recheck his vitamin D levels. Perhaps the lack of sunlight is affecting his mood." There was a second of silence on the line. "Yes, sir. But I think he's lonely." Damien paused. Lonely. It was a variable he couldn't quantify. Junk data. "That is a subjective assessment, nurse. Stick to the measurable metrics." He ended the call. He hated the illogic of illness. He hated the inefficiency of death. His father, Arthur Thorne, the man who had built an empire from crude semiconductors, was now malfunctioning in an upstairs room of the Pacific Heights mansion. A faulty system Damien couldn't fix. He turned back to the window. A memory flashed. 15 years ago. He, a 20-year-old Stanford student, had run home clutching a sheaf of printouts. He had perfected his first predictive algorithm. "Dad, look," he said excitedly. "It can predict consumer behavior with 94% accuracy. I'm going to change the advertising industry." Arthur, still robust, then was sitting by the fire. He took the papers, glanced at the complex equations, then set them down. He looked Damien straight in the eye. His gaze didn't hold the pride Damien expected, only a distant sadness. "But does it make you happy, Damien?" The question had stunned him. Happy, that was an irrelevant outcome. "It works," Damien replied a little defensively. "It has value." "Value isn't always on a balance sheet," Arthur had said. Damien had never understood what he meant. Now he stood in his $1 million office, a king of algorithms. He could feel the pressure of some emotion trying to form in his chest, grief perhaps. He knew theoretically that he should be grieving his dying father. He looked at the only photograph in the office, a small picture of his mother, who had died when he was too young. The only person who had ever connected him to his father. He tried. He tried to summon the feeling. He tried to force a tear. Nothing. Only the sterile silence of the room and the faint hum of a server rack. A total system failure. Technology had betrayed Damien. His Tesla Model S Plaid, a marvel of engineering, worth over $150,000, had decided its autopilot software had an unknown logical error right in the middle of the Bay Bridge. It had pulled over, refusing to move, defiantly silent. After 45 frustrating minutes in a tow truck, he was dropped at the Embarcadero station. Forced to do something he hadn't done in at least a decade, take the BART home. Now he stood on the Powell Street platform, waiting for a northbound train. His bespoke Brioni suit seemed to draw every eye, but it also felt like a thin armor against the chaos of the place. The smell of mildew and cheap Javel bleach hit his nose. He hated it. He hated the inefficiency, the unpredictability of the crowd. People bumped into each other without order. This was an analog system, a human mess. He was checking market data on his phone, trying to erect a digital wall around himself, when a sound cut through the noise. It wasn't the sarabande Chloe had played earlier. This was something else. A melody he had never heard. It wasn't as technically complex as Bach, but it was heavy. The melody began on a low sustained note like an unanswered question, then climbed, breaking into a short staccato series of chords like a suppressed sob, like pain distilled into pure sound. Damien looked up. He saw her. The woman with the tangled hair and the thin wool coat. Her music, even coming from that cheap instrument, seemed to be bending the air around it. It wasn't data. It was something primal. It bypassed his logical shell and struck him straight in the chest. A strange, almost painful tightness rose in his throat. It made him remember. Not a specific memory, but a feeling. The feeling of his mother's arms, an impression as faint as smoke from long before she died. It was a warmth and safety he had forgotten he'd ever had. That melody held sorrow. Yes, but also a resilience that was stubborn to its core. It was the sound of something broken that refused to die. His train was arriving. Its screech grew louder. Damien didn't think. He acted. He moved toward her, his strides fast and decisive, the same way he entered a boardroom to close a deal. Chloe had just finished the piece. She exhaled her breath, a thin cloud in the subterranean air. She opened her eyes and saw a tall, expensive man standing over her. Damien didn't say hello. He didn't have time for such useless pleasantries. "I want to hire that," he said, his voice flat and precise. He jutted his chin toward the violin. Chloe blinked, confused. "Hire? That sound you just made, that melody, Ben," he clarified. "I want to hire it. $10,000 a week." The entire station seemed to recede for Chloe. 10,000. What? What did you say? A transaction? Damien said, a hint of impatience. You play, I pay. I need you to play for my father. He's dying. His words landed between them cold and heavy as pebbles. He's dying. He said it with less emotion than he'd reported his broken-down Tesla. His train screeched to a halt. The doors opened. Chloe just stood there, stunned, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Damien huffed, realizing he might miss his train. He pulled out his wallet, retrieving a business card. It wasn't paper. It was brushed titanium, the letters laser engraved. Think about it. This is the address. Start tomorrow, 7 p.m. He placed the card in her open case right next to the quarter. The metallic clink was sharp. He turned on his heel and stepped onto the train just as the doors slid shut. Chloe stood frozen for several seconds. The train sped away, leaving a vortex of wind and relative silence. She looked down at the titanium card. It lay there brazen and arrogant. Damien Thorne, CEO, Thorne Axiom Ventures. $10,000. The initial shock evaporated, replaced by a hot anger that started in her stomach. It wasn't just an insult. It was a violation. Who the hell did he think he was? Some rich, condescending tech bro who thought everything in the world could be bought with an app or a check. He thought he could just walk up and buy her grief, buy the melody she had wrung from her very soul. A melody woven from medical bills, from the memory of her father, from the betrayal of the Galliano. Bastard, she whispered, her voice hoarse. She picked up the card. It was freezing cold in her numb hand. Her first instinct was to throw it onto the tracks. But then the phone in her pocket buzzed again. With a weary instinct, she pulled it out. The landlord again. Landlord 40H notice has been served. Locks will be changed. Wednesday a.m. Wednesday. That was the day after tomorrow. The image of herself being thrown onto the street with her violin and her single suitcase became vividly clear. Cold dread more real than the station's chill extinguished her anger. $10,000. This wasn't about art anymore. It was about survival. The contempt was still there, but it now had to fight for space with desperation. She stared at the card, the contrast between its sleek titanium surface and her phone's cracked screen, feeling like a cruel cosmic joke. The next evening at 7:05, Chloe stood in front of a house in Pacific Heights. It didn't look like a house. It looked like a fortress of glass and limestone looming over the San Francisco Bay, like an arrogant god. She had rung the bell. The heavy oak door swung open without a sound. Damien stood there dressed in a gray cashmere sweater and slacks. He looked almost confused to see her, as if he'd forgotten his own offer. "You came," he stated. "Good. Efficient." He led her through a hallway that looked like a contemporary art gallery, cold, empty, and expensive. "My father is upstairs," he said. "Just play. Play that piece from yesterday. I need a response." Chloe stopped at the base of the staircase. She gripped her case. "Before I start?" she said, her voice surprisingly resonant in the sterile space. Damien turned, raising an eyebrow. "I'm here for the money," Chloe said, looking him straight in the eye. "Only the money. You're buying my time and my skill, but you don't get the rest." Damien blinked, uncomprehending. The rest? My emotions, Chloe said, her voice sharp as a knife. You don't ever get to tell me how to feel. And you don't ever get to tell me how to play. I'll play what I see fit. That's the deal. Damien stared at her for a long moment. He was analyzing her. A new variable, an unforeseen contract clause. Finally, he gave a single curt nod. Accepted, he said, as long as it produces a result. He didn't get it, Chloe realized. He truly didn't get it at all. He was trying to apply Silicon Valley logic to human grief, and that she thought was perhaps the greatest tragedy in this entire house. Arthur Thorne's room wasn't a bedroom. It was a glass cage. 3 walls were made entirely of floor-to-ceiling tempered glass, offering an unobstructed 180-degree view of the San Francisco Bay. Even on a clear night, the Golden Gate Bridge, brilliant under its lights, looked distant and cold. Everything in the room was white charcoal gray or stainless steel. The furniture was minimalist to the point of being cruel. The only thing breaking the sterility was an array of medical machines beeping and hissing steadily next to the modern hospital bed. Arthur Thorne lay there shrunken beneath the thin sheets, his eyes open but vacant, fixed on the distant lights of the bridge. He looked like just another exhibit in Damien's collection. Chloe felt the air being sucked from her lungs. This room was too big, too silent. Its luxury was suffocating. She stood in a corner feeling small and ridiculously out of place. Begin, Damien ordered. He wasn't sitting. He stood with his arms crossed in the farthest corner, leaning against a polished concrete wall, his phone glowing in his hand. Chloe swallowed dryly. She raised her cheap violin. She tried to play Bach's Sarabande, the piece she had played at the station. But here in this cold, cavernous space, the sound was pathetic. It was thin, weak. Each note seemed to die the moment it left the strings, swallowed by the room's wealthy silence. She glanced at Damien. He wasn't looking at her. He was taking notes on his phone. A surge of anger rose in her. He was auditing her. He was monitoring his investment. She wasn't a musician. She was a data point on his spreadsheet. She tried to play, but the artificiality of the situation was strangling the music. She was performing for a man who couldn't hear and a man who wouldn't listen. She played for another 10 minutes, her heart growing heavier. Arthur Thorne didn't move, not a blink, not a change in his breathing. Finally, she lowered the violin. The silence rushed back in, even heavier than before. Damien looked up, his expression one of clear disappointment. Is that it? Chloe didn't answer. She began to pack her instrument. He walked toward her, blocking her at the door. Not effective, he said flatly. 0 response rate. His condition is unchanged. Chloe looked up at him, her eyes like ice. What did you expect? A miracle? I expect results. Damien shot back, his voice as sharp as his titanium card. I paid for the sound you made at the station. That sound. Not this dreary funeral music. The condescension in his voice made Chloe flinch. Tomorrow, he commanded, you play the exact piece from the station, your piece. I need consistent data to evaluate. Chloe stared at him. She didn't say a word. She pushed past him and walked out of the cold room, the steady beeping of the medical machine seeing her out. She almost didn't go back. The thought of returning to that glass tomb to perform like a wind-up monkey for an unfeeling CEO made her sick. But the image of the eviction notice won. The next night, 7 o'clock, she was at the door again. Damien was already there in his usual spot, phone ready. Arthur was the same, immobile. Chloe took a deep breath. She set her case down. But she didn't open it. Instead, she looked directly at Damien. "You," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with surprising authority. "Get out." Damien raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from annoyance to mild shock at the audacity. "Excuse me." "You're the problem," Chloe said, stepping toward him. "You're suffocating this room. You stand there like a warden waiting for a performance." "He'll never respond with you here. Your presence is noise." Damien was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that, least of all someone on his payroll. He was about to offer a cutting rebuttal, but something in her eyes, a raw, almost desperate honesty, stopped him. And a part of his analytical brain was curious. This variable had changed. "You have 5 minutes, he said, and stepped out of the room. The heavy wooden door closing behind him with a soft thud. The room changed instantly. The tension evaporated. It was just Chloe, Arthur, and the steady machines. Chloe exhaled. She didn't reach for her violin. She pulled an expensive minimalist chair to the bedside. She sat so close she could see the thin blue veins on Arthur's eyelids. "Hi, Mr. Farthorne," she whispered. "My name is Chloe." She watched him for a long moment. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm not going to play for your son anymore. I think I'll play for you." She paused. "I miss my dad too," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "He just died. He was a cellist. He taught me to play." She unconsciously reached out to touch the violin case. "This violin," she gave a sad laugh, "it's junk. The real one, my family's violin. I had to sell it to pay for the medicine." She looked into Arthur's vacant eyes. "I sold his legacy for a few more weeks, and it's killing me every day." She sat there, letting her confession hang in the air. Then she opened her case. But she didn't play Bach. She didn't play her own piece. She played something from deep in her memory. A melody her father used to play when he thought no one was listening. An old, simple American folk song, Shenandoah. She played it softly with no technical flair. The melody, nostalgic and yearning for a place and a river, filled the room. She played with all the empathy she had, pouring her own grief into every note. She was playing eyes closed when she heard a sound. A sharp intake of breath. A gasp. She opened her eyes. The nurse, who had been standing silently in the corner, had her hand to her mouth. Chloe looked at Arthur. He was crying. A single shining tear was slowly tracking from the corner of his eye across his sunken temple and disappearing into his silver hair. Damien stood in the hall, feeling out of control. He hated this feeling. 5 minutes had passed. Then 10. He was considering storming in and ending this farce. Then he heard the music. It wasn't the jarring, angry piece the girl had played at the station. It wasn't the dry classical music from last night either. This melody was different. It was simple, almost naive, but it carried the weight of history. It was slow and full of longing. And then he heard another sound, even more alarming, Chloe's voice. She was whispering to his father. He couldn't make out the words, but her tone, warm and intimate, was something he had never dared to use with Arthur. An irrational anger rose in him. Who was she to? The door opened. The nurse, whom Damien had always considered part of the machinery, rushed out, her face pale. She nearly collided with Damien. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice trembling. "What is it? Did his metrics drop?" Damien asked, immediately shifting into crisis mode. "No, sir. He's crying," the nurse whispered, as if she'd just witnessed a miracle. When the girl played that song, he cried. She hurried down the hall, almost talking to herself. "I have to log this. It's incredible." Damien stood motionless, crying. His father hadn't shown emotion in years. Damien had tried everything, the best doctors, the most advanced drugs, even virtual reality simulations of his favorite places. All had failed. 0 response rate. And yet this girl with her cheap violin and a dusty folk song had done it in 10 minutes. For the first time, a terrifying thought crept into Damien's tightly controlled mind. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe the problem wasn't finding the right drug or the right algorithm. Maybe he had been trying to solve an emotional problem with logic. He was beginning to realize this wasn't a transaction. It was a language, one that Chloe understood, and in which he was completely illiterate. A new kind of fear hit him. The fear of all the years he had wasted trying to optimize a relationship instead of simply living it. The fear of what he had missed. The next night, Chloe arrived. Damien was already in the room, but this time he wasn't standing in the corner. He was sitting in a chair a few feet from the bed, and his phone was in his pocket. Chloe looked at him, slightly surprised. He just gave a small nod, gesturing for her to begin. She didn't speak to Arthur tonight. She simply pulled her chair to its usual spot. She looked at the dying man, and then she began to play. She played Shenandoah again, and then other old Appalachian tunes, simple melodies of love and loss. Damien sat there still as a statue. He didn't take notes. He didn't analyze. He just closed his eyes. And for the first time in his life, he tried to listen. The storm hit from the Pacific just after midnight like an angry fist. This wasn't San Francisco's gentle fog. This was a real storm, a roaring pineapple express, carrying hurricane-force winds and walls of rain that slammed against the glass windows of the Pacific Heights mansion. Inside the sterile room, the massive panes of glass, usually as still as a painting, were now visibly vibrating in their frames. The wind whistling through the gaps sounded like a wail. The storm outside was mirrored by the storm within. The medical machines were no longer beeping steadily. They were screaming. The shrill, rapid beeping of the heart monitor blended with the deep, urgent hiss of the ventilator. Arthur's oxygen saturation was plummeting. His heart, already weak, was beating erratically like a failing engine. 2 a.m. Damien stood by the bed, completely rigid. The nurse was hurrying, adjusting IV lines, her voice tense as she spoke to the doctor on the phone. Unstable rhythm. BP is dropping fast. Damien heard nothing but the noise of the storm, the noise of the machines, and the white noise of panic rising in his own head. All his systems were flashing red. Every scenario he had run in his mind was failing. He looked at his father. Arthur's eyes were wide, no longer vacant. They were filled with something Damien had never seen in him, sheer terror. Damien's mind screamed, "Do something! Fix it!" But there was nothing to fix. His hand trembled. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call another medical specialist in Switzerland. He scrolled through his contacts, finding a name he had only saved 2 weeks ago. Chloe, violin. He hit call. Chloe jolted awake in her cramped, cold Tenderloin studio. The rain hammered her single window like gravel. She saw the phone. Damien Thorne. 2:17 a.m. Her heart pounding, she answered. "Hello. You have to come." Damien's voice came through the phone, no longer the flat-controlled CEO. It was broken. It was wild and frantic. "What, Damien? It's right now," he yelled, a raw sound of desperation. He's going. He's not listening to me. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say." That sentence hit Chloe in the chest. She hung up. She didn't change. She just shoved her feet into sneakers, grabbed her coat, and snatched her violin case. 25 minutes later, a rain-soaked taxi dropped her in front of the mansion. The security guard, who usually eyed her with suspicion, opened the gate immediately, his face pale in the security lights. She ran into the hall, wet hair plastered to her face. She sprinted up the stairs, following the sound of the screaming machines. The scene in the bedroom looked like a war zone. The nurse was performing chest compressions. Damien stood back, hands raking through his hair, his face a terrible mask of distortion. "Stop!" Damien yelled at the nurse. "Stop!" He signed. He signed a DNR. The nurse fell back, gasping. The compression stopped. There was only the long, monotone beep of the flatlined heart monitor and the howl of the wind. But Arthur wasn't gone. He let out a breath, a painful, rattling wheeze. His eyes found Damien. Damien lunged at the bed, grabbing his father's frail hand. He was talking fast, babbling, trying to pull him back with the only language he knew. Dad, listen to me," he sobbed. "The NASDAQ. I was right. I was right about everything. The new fund. I closed it. 5 billion. I did it." He was begging not for his father, but for himself. "I succeeded, didn't I? I did it right. Didn't I, Dad?" Chloe stood in the doorway, horrified by the tragedy unfolding. Damien wasn't talking to his father. He was reading a profit report to a ghost. And the worst part was Arthur was trying to answer. Arthur's weak hand trembled in Damien's. He tried to lift it, not to grasp, but to touch his son's face. His lips fluttered. His eyes pleaded with Damien to stop talking about stocks, about funds, about success, to stop and just be here. But Damien didn't see. He was lost in his own panic, still rambling about meaningless achievements. "Chloe," the nurse whispered, noticing her presence. Damien spun around. His eyes found her. The veneer of CEO Oracle Billionaire. All of it was shattered. Before her was just a 40-year-old child, lost and terrified. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rain, lashing the glass and Arthur's ragged, shallow breaths. Damien looked at Chloe. His face was the wreckage of his shattered arrogance. Logic had failed. Data was meaningless. He was out of equations. "Please," he whispered. A word he rarely used, and never like this. It wasn't a command. It was a surrender. "Play," he begged, his voice cracking. "Not the old songs. Play your song. The one from the station." He was begging for her language, because his own had failed so catastrophically. Chloe understood it all in that moment. He didn't want to soothe his father anymore. He wanted something to hold on to. He needed something to fill the terrifying silence of impending death. She didn't move. She just stood there, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the marble floor. She raised the cheap violin to her shoulder, and she played. She didn't play Bach. She didn't play Shenandoah. She played her melody. The song born from her own anger, desperation, and grief. The melody that had cut through the noise of Powell Station. The melody that had made Damien Thorne stop. The sound erupted raw, imperfect, and terribly strong. It was a wrenching series of minor chords escalating to a single piercing high note before breaking into a melody that was sad but defiant. It was the sound of a heart that was broken but refused to stop beating. The music filled the room. It drowned out the storm. It drowned out the machines. It shattered Damien's last wall of defense. A strange, strangled sound tore from his chest. The mask of control disintegrated. He knelt. Not an elegant kneel. He collapsed by the hospital bed. He buried his head in the sheets next to his father's thin hand. And he wept. Not silent, noble tears. It was a gut-wrenching sob, a lifetime of suppressed release. The cry of a child realizing he was about to be an orphan. The cry of a man realizing he had wasted so much time. Chloe's music swelled, wrapping around him, giving him permission to break. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words muffled by the sheets. "I'm sorry. Dad?" He raised his head, his face streaming with tears. He grabbed his father's hand, but this time not to talk about work. I didn't know any other way," he confessed to his father. I just wanted you to be proud. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't know how to listen." A miracle happened. Amid the storm and the violin, Arthur Thorne, on the very threshold of death, heard. The fearful spasm stopped. The tension left his body. A deep, almost impossible peace settled over his gaunt features. He used his last ounce of strength, a phenomenal effort of will. His fingers moved. Weakly they fluttered and landed in Damien's disheveled hair. His mouth moved. A sound escaped less than a whisper. But in the sudden quiet of the room, as Chloe played one long, soft note, it echoed like thunder. "My son." And then he exhaled. One last time. Gently. His hand fell slack. The monotone beep of the heart monitor returned, but no one cared about it anymore. The storm still raged outside. Damien Thorne, the unfeeling billionaire, was slumped over his father's body, his entire frame shaking with uncontrollable sobs. And Chloe stood there, her own tears mixing with the rain still playing. Her music was no longer a scream. It had become a prayer, a thin bridge of sound across the abyss between life and death, between two men who had finally found each other in the very last moment. 2 weeks passed. The storm had broken, leaving behind a washed clean San Francisco, a ruthlessly clear blue sky, and a crisp autumn chill. The funeral had taken place, a discreet and formal affair as expected. Damien arranged to meet Chloe somewhere that was neither the mansion nor the subway station. They met at Golden Gate Park near the Japanese tea garden. Arthur had taken him here when he was a boy, before Damien learned to scorn inefficient walks. Damien had changed. He wasn't wearing a Brioni suit or a cashmere sweater. He wore an old charcoal gray wool coat and frayed jeans. He looked tired, thinner, and present. His eyes, once sharp and analytical, were now distant, hollowed. They walked for a while in silence, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "Thank you," Damien finally said. His voice was hoarse, lacking its former sharp confidence. "For being there." Chloe nodded, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. "I'm sorry about your father." Damien stopped by a bench overlooking the lake. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. It was thick. "Here," he said, holding it out to her, "for your time, and for everything." Chloe looked at the envelope, then up at him. She didn't take it. "I can't." "It's 50,000, Damien said, as if that explained everything. "It'll help you. Buy a new violin, find a better place to live." "Damien," Chloe said, her voice gentle but firm. She pushed his hand back. "I can't accept this. The first week that was a contract. I took the $10,000. That's what we agreed to. But that night, Chloe interrupted, was not a transaction. It wasn't for sale." Damien stared at her. He had expected resistance, but this absolute integrity, it baffled him. He pulled the check from the envelope, looked at it for a moment, then tore it in half. He stuffed the pieces back into his pocket. "I understand," he whispered. They fell silent again. This time it wasn't awkward. "The violin you sold?" Damien asked, suddenly turning to her. "Your father's violin. Tell me about it." Chloe was surprised. It was the first time he had asked a question not intended to gather data for an action. He was just asking. And so she told him. She told him about her great-grandfather, a musician in Naples, who had brought the Galliano to America. She told him about her father teaching her her first notes on it, about its warm, human-voiced resonance. She told him about the guilt of selling it. Damien sat there. He didn't interrupt. He didn't check his phone. He just listened, his face turned toward the rippling surface of the lake as Chloe told him her story. Damien's change wasn't a sudden transformation, but a fundamental realignment. He was still a man of systems and logic, but he now had a new operating system. A week later, Damien was in a penthouse overlooking the Arno River in Florence, Italy. He had used his entire network not to find a startup, but to track down a Galliano built in 1742. The current collector, an elderly Italian contessa named Isabella, had no intention of selling. She had enough money. "Mr. Thorne," she said in melodic English, sipping an espresso, "it is part of my soul. Not everything has a price." The Damien of 3 months ago would have doubled the offer. He would have steamrolled her with money. The current Damien nodded. "I understand, Contessa. I'm not here to buy it." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm here," Damien said, "to tell you the story of its real owner." And he told her. He told her about Chloe, about her father, about the subway station, and about the stormy night in his father's room. He told the story not as a negotiation tactic, but because it was the truth. He explained that the violin wasn't a collectible. It was a legacy, a silenced voice. When he finished, the Contessa looked at him for a long time. She stood, walked to the window, and then turned back. "A violin," she said softly, "needs to be played. It should not be silent in a collection, no matter how beautiful it is." Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, Chloe was standing in line at the post office. With the $10,000, she had done 2 things. She paid off the remaining balance of her father's medical debt, an act that brought a painful, visceral relief. And she had paid 3 months' rent in advance. She had bought herself time. Now she stood before a simple granite headstone in Colma, the city of the dead, south of San Francisco. She set down a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I paid it all off, Dad," she whispered. "I'm free." But the freedom felt hollow. The job was done. The contract was over. It was just her and her cheap violin. She knew what she had to do next, not for money, but for the music. 3 months later, the audition room for the San Francisco Community Symphony was small wood-paneled and had poor acoustics. Chloe had just finished her piece, an excerpt from a Tchaikovsky symphony. She played with all her soul, but she could hear the thin, reedy sound of the cheap violin. The judges nodded politely. "Thank you. We'll let you know." She walked off the stage, the familiar feeling of disappointment settling in. She stepped into the empty, dimly lit auditorium and stopped. A man was sitting in the 10th row. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple shirt. "Damien." He stood up. He didn't smile, perhaps he still hadn't learned how to do that easily, but his gaze was focused. He said nothing, just picked up an object resting on the seat next to him and walked toward her. It was a violin case, old, dark brown leather scuffed at the corners, but perfectly preserved. Chloe's heart stopped. She knew that case. She knew every scratch on it. How? She breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Damien set the case on the stage floor. He undid the latches. He didn't touch the violin. He stepped back, letting her do it. Chloe knelt. She held her breath. It was lying there. The Gagliano. Its amber varnish seemed to glow even in the dim theater light. It smelled like her memories, old wood rosin, and something faintly like her father's house. She reached out a trembling hand, her calloused fingers brushing lightly against the strings. Tears began to well, hot and unstoppable. She looked up at Damien, a silent question in her eyes. "My father," Damien said, his voice low and soft. "He left a very specific will. He instructed me to stop trading in numbers and start investing in things of actual value." He looked at the violin. "I figured this was my first investment." Chloe wiped her tears. She stood up. She carefully lifted the Gagliano from its case. It settled onto her shoulder like a long-lost part of her body. It felt right. "Do you want to hear it?" she asked. Damien nodded. He didn't go back to his seat. He just stood there a few feet away, like a witness. Chloe closed her eyes. She raised the bow. She didn't play Bach. She didn't play Tchaikovsky. She played her melody, the song from the subway station. But this time it was changed. From the Gagliano, the sound was no longer a thin scream. It was a full, rich, complex voice. It still held the sadness, still held the loss, but it now resonated with a deep warmth, a tempered strength. The sadness wasn't gone. It had been transformed into beauty. The melody resonated in the empty theater. Damien Thorne stood there perfectly still. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just hearing. He understood. Damien tried to buy an emotion only to realize the one thing he truly lacked was connection. What did you think of Chloe's choice to refuse the $50,000? Was it integrity or was it foolish? Let us know in the comments below. If you love meaningful stories that touch the heart, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.